Okay, let's see. To get anything inspiring.
And when Almeida was a teenager, Harry would pay him to watch his card mixer up and down, but they stayed. And so now, Commander Almeida,
I've never even used the bonus.
He comes to see Harry, and we now know. Commander Almeida,
I got a bunch of these.
2 months before the Bay of Pigs, that he was ready to defect and help the United States. The CIA didn't act on that, even though
backs, motherfucker.
Because the CIA was confident the mafia was going to kill Fidel, so they didn't need the help.
I actually already put $15 once and $10 or $5 something another time. Hold up. Where's the 20-pack promo?
That I think Fidel's going off the rails. It's not the socialist paradise. It's on its way to becoming a dictatorship. A bunch of people Nixon supported dictator Batista, but a lot of those guys had gone by the wayside. They had to fled and they killed. And so that friendship.
What the fuck?
Harry and the other badly wounded prisoners were released and told to go to the United
Was it a daily deal?
End of 1962 to get the Kennedys to ransom the other Bay of Pigs prisoners or cash them in.
I've seen it a couple of times, so I thought it was. Do I have all the sagas, or is this just the style? I think that's just cosmetic. I think.
And things dragged out, and Richard Nixon was responsible for the whole mess. Torpedoes, early plans to get the prisoners out. So this became a very dramatic thing, and Harry and Robert Kennedy got those prisoners out by Christmas of 1962.
I remember Harry telling us.
I've been saving for a minute, motherfucker.
We're talking with Lamar Waldron, and we'll be right back. It's a deep dive into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Stick around. As to Harry Williams, and
it was alchemy.
Was talking, when we met with Harry. Although I want to, really do the deep dive on this on the other side of this break.
No, it was Crimson Vow. Hold on.
Details that are good to go into before the
but
break,
it was 20 packs, motherfucker.
That's very interesting. So Harry was such a hero. So first he's a hero at the Bay of Pigs. Then everybody who's a Cuban American knows that he's the guy that got the Kennedys to get those Bay of Pigs prisoners out. And by the way,
I'm running my own fucking shot here. Now I'm pissed. There was a 15,000 gold, which I just now have. 15,000 gold, 20-pack bundle.
We're told they would have to come back by the end of the year. And if they didn't, then one person would be shot. One prisoner would be shot for every man. So that was the sword of Damocles. So as it got closer...
I don't know whether this is just art or how that works.
Harry would go to Bobby's house, go to Bobby's apartment in New York City. Even when Harry would say something like... because Harry didn't know a lot about...
I don't remember...
Harry said, I don't think Jimmy...
And soon, I don't remember...
You might remember, Harry said Bobby, who wasn't a short guy, stood up on a chair and just got livid and started lecturing about all the mafia connections of Jimmy.
By the Avatar.
Which Harry, had lived
Nico
in
Ballas.
see those hearings. So Harry
Of course.
understood. And there were times when they were in Bobby's apartment in New York City. And Bobby Kennedy was the son of one of the richest men in America, Joseph Kennedy. He was kind of like Bill Gates of his era, Warren Buffett of his era. And
Take a look around, see if I can find...
So Harry would always be paying the cab fare for the son of one of America's richest men. But they, it was all good.
I'm pissed, basically it's 5 free packs. It's 1,000 each, but for 15,000, you got 20 packs.
By Christmas, that it was just, they developed this close bond, and that bond remained not just through 1963, but into 64, and in fact,
look at random now.
Into detail in Bobby's assassination, weeks before Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Harry hadn't seen Bobby for a while. They got together, and Harry told us, he said, they're going to kill you. And by then, Harry was meaning, Hoffa and the Mafia people.
Right.
And so...
And Harry told us this.
And Harry told us this. Harry told Bobby... Imagine Harry telling Bobby that. So
I am so pissed.
Bobby Kennedy was in San Francisco, standing in an open convertible. And there was what sounded like a gunshot. And Ethel Kennedy was with him. She hit the floorboard. And Bobby, people said like his knees were going to buckle, but he managed to stay, standing up. But yeah, he knew. Harry had told him, that was going to happen. So Harry Williams was just such a key person to all this. And after the break, we're gonna quickly get into just the meat of this incredibly secret stuff he told us, and that other people that work for John Robert Kennedy confirmed.
We'll be right back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Tom Hartman's program. We'll have Mal Waldron, author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, and two other books about the Kennedy assassination we worked on for years. That were authored by both of us. Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy. Did the majority of the work on these books. So, Lamar, Harry Williams, very close friend with Bobby Kennedy, spends time with him in New York, spends time with him in the Hamptons, is working with him to try to overthrow the Pig's hero. Let me just toss it to you. Continue.
What happened was, it became known in the Cuban community in Miami, which still had a lot of back and forth at that time with Cuba, of course, that Bobby Kennedy and Harry Williams were close.
I have half a mind to buy one of these.
Williams gets a call from his old friend, the commander of the Cuban army, actually the guy who founded the Cuban army back when there were only like Castro and his 12 disciples. Literally, the guy who founded the Cuban army and was the commander of the Cuban army, Commander Juan Almeida, called Harry on the phone in Miami. And Harry's a little cautious because he's like, well, isn't this phone bugged? And Almeida says, oh, no, I control, that's controlled by the army, monitoring the conversations, to between Cuba and Miami. So, no, you don't have to worry. This is probably the only safe line in all of Cuba to talk on. And he says, look, if you can get Bobby to get JFK on board, kind of like we had talked about back in the spring of 61, but now it's May of 63, I'll overthrow Fidel Castro for you. But I've got to know, I've got to have the support of the President of the United States. So I actually have Bobby Kennedy's phone logs from that time. And you can see Bobby gets a call from Harry Williams. Bobby Kennedy calls JFK. They no doubt talk about Almeida's offer. And then Bobby Kennedy calls Harry Williams back. No doubt saying that, JFK is on board. And by the way, it's within a week of that we now have files, thanks to the 5th committee, the Assassination Records Review.
Welcome to my humble home.
That high levels of the
Here's just a few of the many resources out there.
Other national security groups.
It's jam-packed with expert information and strategy.
Yes, high level.
And you can always replay the
official or to make an outreach to the United States. And of course, so they start making keep going all the way through November. But of course, most of the people working on those plans are just looking at it as like
beating around the bush. I don't want to just buy a bunch.
In reality, only JFK, Robert
if I get some from a random older set, that's not really good. Because whatever mechanic you're working with there, you won't have enough of it to be worthwhile. Getting 20 packs would have been worth it.
Literally, we have the date from the CIA file and implying if I hear it, it was literally 10 days after Dallas, December 1st.
All right, right, let's go look at these. And maybe I might.
Planning literally calls that
on that day, and the thing that stopped it was Kennedy being assassinated.
Exactly. So a couple more important, super important things about the coup plan. It's different from the fact of how secret it was. As far as I can tell, only about a dozen American officials, including JFK and Bobby, of course, and Cyrus Vance, and Alexander Haig, of all people, knew that all this planning that started the week after Almeida called Harry Vance wasn't just a what-if scenario, but it was the real thing.
Ooh, okay, a
Also
dungeon.
had to figure out what to do to deny, to have deniability, and this is what led to the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination.
And as Harry Williams told us, there would be someone in Cuba to take the fall for it, and from those planning documents, we know that would be a Russian or a Russian sympathizer. In Cuba, and they would take the blame.
Can you spell Lee Harvey Oswald? We're doing a special 3-hour deep dive into the Kennedy assassination with my old friend, colleague, co-author, Lamar Waldron, the books that we wrote together about this ultimate sacrifice and legacy of secrecy. Also, Lamar's most recent book, The Watergate, The Hidden History, and The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. Variety magazine called the JFK Historian, the Chicago Tribune called him one of the best investigative journalists in America. And we started with
Boy, I need my glasses. These aren't bad. Interesting.
From across the political spectrum, we'll back them, the CIA is giving money to lots of other people, but we'll give some real money to the people you pick, and then they will all have to agree to work with Commander Almeida in a coalition government after the coup. Because, again, the Kennedys didn't view this as assassination. They viewed it as, well, the word everybody used was elimination. Cubans overthrow Castro, and then.
So what do I do?
The mafia.
Watch it have like a special on the weekend or whatever.
Just because it's a whole brand new era. The biggest point that we made last hour that I failed to mention was that revealed to us, and that
what everyone else is playing right now isn't always the best thing.
Juan Almeida had reached out to Hillary and said, I'm willing to help overthrow Castro and the Castro regime, particularly after that happens. Bobby took this to John. John signed off on it. Bobby signed off on it. Cyrus Vance knew about it. John Nolan, Bobby Kennedy.
You can't do these and.
Secret program, unfortunately, were determined they would keep the mafia out of the system. They didn't know the CIA was still working with the mafia to try to stop it. They were determined to keep these mobsters that Bobby was prosecuting, makes sense, out of the coup plan, and the mafia would be forbidden from reopening their posh casinos in Cuba after the coup.
Just open those and we'll see.
Totally shut out. The mafia had nothing to gain by letting this coup plan go on. So, unfortunately, at least half a dozen members of the mafia, and by that I mean mafia associates as well as made members, coup plan. I mean, people ranging from Jack Ruby to the guy John Martino I had mentioned earlier, David Morales, the head of CIA operations in Miami. So a half dozen mobsters and mafia associates, which of course would include Marcello, the godfather of Louisiana.
Wow, that's kind of cool.
Godfather of Tampa and much of Florida, and Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Hollywood and Las Vegas, who was the biggest CIA asset of the group. They found out.
I have one of those too.
And so what happened was as hard as Bobby and Harry tried to keep the mafia out, they were able to worm their way in, learn about this plan, and they knew this was so secret. A year after we almost got blown up at the Cuban Missile Crisis, that this would have, that if they could somehow mix their plans, the Kennedy plans to stage the coup in Cuba, if they could mix.
I already have a lot of these cards. Ooh, okay.
To use their CIA help, not to kill Fidel, but to kill JFK, that would force a cover-up that wouldn't last weeks or months, that could last years and decades, and it has.
Maybe we should pause here for one moment and point out that at this point now, late 1963, as the mafia has found out about all this stuff, they have also decided that they're going to kill John Kennedy.
Exactly, and we'll get into more detail on that later. But yeah, they originally were going to kill Bobby Kennedy, because he was the attorney general prosecuting them. And Hopper was determined to do that. We talked to
only
the people
two first cards. I already have some of the others.
But as Carlos Marcello explained to one of his friends, and I'm sure also explained to his close associate Jimmy Hoffa, if you kill if you kill Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, JFK will just send his army after you.
Yeah, wasn't the phrase he used in that when we talked with his lawyer?
Exactly what he said was, if you cut off the tail of a dog, meaning if you kill Bobby Kennedy, JFK will turn around and bite you.
Triple color, what?
If you cut off the head of a dog, then the tail quits riding.
Hamster.
So literally the day
a hamster named Boo, what the fuck?
So Harry Williams had his 4 other groups. They were called Bobby Kennedy's 5 Fingers, because after Almeida staged the coup and blamed Fidel and probably Raúl's death on a Russian or Russian sympathizer, just like if you open up your hand,
and he can blow it up too. I've got a lot of dual mana, dual color lands, so I can build weird decks like that if I want to.
Being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. So the first U.S. troops into Cuba after the coup, not a bunch of crew-cut, all-white U.S. Marines. No, it would be Cuban Americans, the veterans from the Bay of Pigs who had been in training, who were now officers and enlisted men, and the officers were being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. So they would be the first U.S. troops in this multiracial group, and it was even commanded by a black man who you talked to. And so this was all set. Harry was meeting with top CIA officials in a safe house in Washington on November 22nd. He was getting ready to go in.
What? Card you own from outside the game. It's like any card I own? What? From outside the game. That's like some Magic Unglued shit right there, man. What? That's weird.
So these Cuban exile groups were trained. The Cuban American troops were trained. Harry was there. And it was all set.
These aren't nearly as many firsts as I would like to apparently have a lot from this question. Ooh, what's this? Oh, shit.
Listening. You and I sat in Colorado in a restaurant with Harry.
Dungeon Descent.
As he laid this whole story out for us, I mean, it was just absolutely breathtaking.
And by the way, the reason he was still alive to talk when so many of his associates were murdered in the 60s and the 70s was because
What's the other?
This man who was a
is it true?
American in Miami who could not buy a drink or a baseball recipe in Miami, he chose to live in
These are like rare.
wilds of Colorado.
Yeah, Bill Cooper thought he was
that kept him alive.
Right, Bill Cooper thought he was hiding out. I mean, it turned out he was just, he was importing guns. but the other thing was that he thought that this plan had been declassified.
Cool.
He didn't realize
I guess. Yeah, I can see both labels. It is two. What's the difference? Just style, I guess.
From the scene in Cuba in the late 1980s. So when I'm talking to Dean Rusk, when we're talking to Harry Williams, and we're about to get into General Oliva and John Nolan, they all assumed that when you disappear in Cuba and you're an official, you're dead, right? Right. So that's the other big reason they were willing to share all this.
Right. So and obviously if the asset in Cuba, the head of the army who was going to overthrow Castro, if he's dead, then the plan must be
This was kind of cool. Should I put the rest on this one, or?
I can think of a couple of incredible things about
I have one of these, and this was a cool card.
we could talk about before the break. Sure. Go for it. So remember, Harry's basically telling everybody he's working with, these Cuban, these other four hand-selected Cuban exile leaders. And this is in the summer and fall of '63, as we're building up to JFK's murder, and the December 1st deadline for the coup, that the mafia is banned from the coup plan.
What?
Not be allowed to reopen their posh casinos after the coup.
8 mana, and if I touch you, you die.
They can get rid of Harry.
That's pretty fucking crazy.
Maybe, two of the people.
And again, that's some wild shit. And I have one of these. It's a good card. Now I have two. You can have up to 4. When you're building a deck, you can have 4 copies of the same card, except for legendaries like this one.
And Tony Verona, a former Cuban senator.
That's uncommon or rare, but not legendary.
That was supposed to take over after the Bay of Pigs. Harry didn't realize that the mafia paid Tony Verona $500,000.
Ooh,
This guy was the guy I was
class.
chasing around Miami.
That's another guy that we'll save for the next one.
All right.
Could you actually
Whoa. Dragon God. 5 mana color. What?
Death squads in Cuba. Vicious guy.
I got a bunch of different multicolor lands, so I can have like 20 lands, each one of them that can make one of 2 colors.
And a couple of his torpedoes. And Masferrer basically
Up to 5 dragon cards, not named Tiamat.
Unless Bobby lets this Cuban thug mafia associate into the
That each
plan,
have different
and Harry's
names.
like, no.
Put them in your hand. So pull the dragon. I could have a dragon of every color. Wow. That's for some complicated deck
building. The guy I mentioned before, Tony Verona, who unknown to Harry's been working with the mafia to get
more of those, or
kind of the back door to the plan. But then, so Harry goes to Guatemala.
Ew, I don't know.
The Cuban exile leaders, Manuel Artemi. Harry goes out to dinner before he's actually going to meet up with Manuel Artemi, because Artemi has a huge U.S.-funded secret camp in Guatemala.
He's doing pretty good.
His troops are going to be, his men are going to be, and they're getting like millions and millions from the CIA under the authorization of the Kennedys, so that they'll be able to get into Cuba after the coup, and Artemi will be part of that coalition.
Get one of these.
But so Harry's, gets into Guatemala. He goes out to dinner at a really nice, fancy restaurant in Guatemala. The next morning, he is going to meet with Manuel Artemi. Now, Manuel Artemi is to the right of Adolf Hitler. Is his best friend in America is a guy named E. Howard Hunt. He's one of the 2 CIA agents that the CIA assigned to work with Harry and to do whatever Harry wanted. Because remember, the CIA isn't calling the shots on the coup plan. Harry Williams and Bobby Kennedy are. And so,
not very impressive.
In that fancy restaurant, a couple of gunmen come in, pull out their guns to kill Harry. Harry pulls out his gun first, shoots and kills one of them, gets in a gun battle with the other, and runs out through the kitchen.
And so, wrapping up this story about Harry Williams and getting into John Nolan here, Lamar.
Right. So again, the plan is put on hold when JFK is killed. And by the way, Bobby Kennedy, good friends with Harry. Bobby's also good friends with Hans Johnson. Washington, who was a top journalist at the time. And so Haynes Johnson calls Bobby Kennedy. Bobby is left to Texas comments even before the assassination. He said his nice estate, Hickory Hill. And Haynes Johnson gets through to Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby, and he mentions that Harry's in the room with him. And Bobby says, put Harry on the line. Harry comes on the line, and I should say,
yeah, I'm
Harry
gonna do it
comes on
from
the
this
line,
one.
Bobby tells journalist Haynes Johnson, who has written a book, by the way, on the Bay of Pigs, with Harry Williams.
Now, this is right after John is shot.
Right. This one in 2 hours. Within 2 hours,
right.
John being shot. Haynes Johnson, like I say, he's visiting Harry at a safe house in Washington, where Harry was.
And he confirmed all this.
Right, and so Harry and Haynes confirmed it.
To us.
And though Harry told a slightly, though Haynes told a slightly different story to another writer until I told him we recorded our interviews with Harry, and then he went back and confirmed what he told us. And that's basically, Bobby Kennedy told Haynes Johnson, one of your guys did it. Manuel Artini, who was the mafia compromise, one of those 5 fingers, Bobby Kennedy, was one of the co-authors who had worked with Haynes Johnson. So Bobby's initial instinct was to finger a mob-connected Cuban exile who was part of the coup plan.
And this is
all first. Wow, that was a good choice.
Pathos or pathos, it's just the kind of awful sadness about this. Bobby, after his brother has been assassinated, 2 hours after his brother was
pretty
assassinated,
fucking badass.
is basically saying to this reporter and to Harry, one of his very closest friends, the program that my brother and I put together to overthrow Castro, that was also going to help him in the election 64, by the way, let's add. That this program that we put together to overthrow Castro is what got turned around and used to kill my brother. And
that's exactly right.
And that just crushed him. I mean, he walked around for months just crushed by the
he was shattered. I mean, we talked to John Davis, the Kennedy, who was part of Jackie Kennedy's family, and of my co-author. He was the Saturday after.
Almost all first, only one card I had before.
Shattered wreck of a person.
Yeah.
So,
and it's pretty cool.
To John Nolan.
It has vigilance, which is a powerful ability.
His body, for some reason, of course, there's no autopsy done in Dallas, and the Kennedy, the security officials, the FBI, Secret Service,
destroy all creatures.
Out of the hospital.
Cost one less for each creature in the battlefield. So if there's a whole bunch of creatures, there's 7 or more creatures in the battlefield, it's free.
They get it to Bethesda.
No, hold on. It could be down to 2 white men.
Why is all that? So one of the people that Harry Williams said we should talk to was a guy named John Nolan. Listeners will not know John Nolan.
Almost all
John Nolan worked at the
knew
Justice
again.
Department. He was an attorney there. He was Bobby Kennedy's chief aide during 1963 and early 64.
From a graveyard, so I can hit the enemy's graveyard, get a free draw.
Running the Cuban operation for JFK was seen by.
There's some weird mana.
So John Nolan knew everything. He is one of those dozen
More
US officials
artifacts.
who knew. Yeah, the coup plan is no what-if possibility. It's a sure thing. And so Harry said, "You guys should talk to
That's
John
kind of
Nolan."
lame.
We called and I arranged a.
It's the same one
He
from
said,
a minute
"Okay,
ago.
you can come to my. We can go out to lunch. I don't really want to talk about this exactly. We can go out to lunch.
All new cards again. Every one of them.
1992. He is a
Not getting a lot of blue. There's one little bit of blue here.
Most powerful
Islands.
He remained close to Bobby Kennedy, working on his last campaign until Bobby was shot. He then remained close to the Kennedy family, giving Ted Kennedy advice after Chappaquiddick that if Ted Kennedy had followed Ted
Oh, another vampire. I was dealing with a card that needed more vampires to work with that deck earlier.
Argues in front of the Supreme Court. Not once or twice, but he represents big companies, but he worked in civil rights for Bobby Kennedy, made some dangerous trips to the South in the summer of '63. So John Nolan
Doing really good with new cards here. Another dragon.
When we come back, I'll tell you the biggest secret that he revealed about JFK's autopsy.
I got that legendary dragon earlier, the Tiamat.
The author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, and the co-author with me.
All new shit. All new shit.
Legacy of Secrecy and
Menace is good.
2 other books about the Kennedy assassination, the Bobby Kennedy assassination, and the Martin Luther King assassination.
The day-night manipulation, that mechanic. So that mechanic is not limited to this one. It's in Innistrad and Neon Dynasty, the new one. They kept it around. It's been fucking 15, 18 years since I've played that.
Cuban-aligned patsy, essentially, taking the credit for it on December 1st, 1963. And
wild cards, 17 rare, 3
big rare. John Nolan, right?
Right. And by the way, it wasn't a Cuban-aligned patsy. It was a Russian-aligned.
Oh, Russian. Thank you very much.
Russian or Russian sympathizer
in Cuba.
It would be.
All right, we got to put some gameplay on the end of this.
Harry's on word. Take the fall. So
I don't have time to build one.
So John Nolan, the top assistant. I mean, Bobby Kennedy had a secretary, Angie Novello, but John Nolan was his high-level executive assistant. Number 2.
I was just fucking around with this. It's not balanced or anything. I just made a bet. This one is. And it's second or third generation. I've refined it like 3 times.
Kennedy the afternoon of the assassination while Bobby was at his estate, and he couldn't, so he was making and blocking all the non-essential. So JFK's body is taken from Dallas against the wishes of the Dallas authorities, thrown to Washington.
All special
Kennedy and new President Lyndon Johnson. And then it is taken to the Bethesda Naval Hospital.
All of them.
There's an autopsy, which has been the subject of many books, many books have been written just about the autopsy because there are so many inconsistencies and mysteries and things that don't add up. And the main autopsy doctor,
is this guy's mana burn?
in the JFK.
No.
So all those questions about the autopsy, as far as I'm concerned, now they've all been answered because so John Nolan, the biggest law firm in Washington, was a senior partner. Meet me for lunch. We were going to talk, and all we were talking about was because he was still friends with Harry Williams after all those years. He trusted Harry. Harry said I was okay with that. He would give me all of this. You just come to the office. Okay. So I said, okay, I'll come to the office. And then he's like, no, we can't do that. We're going to be talking about a plan that's been kept since 1992. And then he's like, I just can't see you. I'm like, look, I flew all the way up here. So he give me a phone in.
Uh-oh, looks like an ass whooper.
Start talking. Every time, and I'm not at the Mayflower where we usually stay. I think we're going high where we would do a communication seminars. And every time I was talking about general stuff, and he was a Korean veteran, my dad was a Korean veteran. He was about the same age as Kenny that I am. He was when I was talking about it. But whenever I would get close to talking about the coup plan, the worst crackling would come on the phone and we would get cut off. I mean, it didn't happen once, it didn't happen twice, it didn't happen 3 times, it didn't happen 4 times, it happened at least 4 times. Because I'm worried, somebody doesn't want to come back there. So I go outside, luckily there's a bellhop, I whip out a 2 or 3 other rooms, plug it in.
Damn, the ass whooping coming, boy.
Something funny about that phone. And so he confirms everything Harry had told us about the coup plan. He confirms that he hired Hunt and James McCord were the top 2 theories. in Washington. And then Bobby was up in the 17th floor family suite at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. I was down in and just outside the autopsy room on the phone. And I was relaying Bobby's
Some more for I'll get the wiki bonus.
physician, Admiral Berkeley, who was in the autopsy room the whole time. And then Admiral Berkeley was giving orders to
This is actually good. I appreciate the JFK conspiracy because it's actually true that there was dirty business.
Admiral Berkeley, the White House physician.
It's just not very important. Oh dear. Ooh, one of my favorite cards. Ooh, but low mana. Ooh.
So I think there are lots of ways.
Ooh. Very low mana. Very, 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 very low mana. Fire. Ooh, yeah. Whoop. Another card. Dungeon Time. Let's see. Wow. Mana that's split color specific but two different colors. That's a new mechanic to me. That damage coming. Lose 2 life and discard a card.
Because if you look at part of the story, there's 2 kinds of economists in the United States. There are those in the large number who went to the usual schools that teach them. And then there is what we basically
Take it. Fuck it.
network. Economists who went to a list of it exists in all disciplines, but it certainly exists in economics. I went to all those schools, and so I know all these people. They're not happy. I didn't turn out right, as far as they're concerned. But I do know them, and they know me, and it creates awkward moments. Bernanke understands what if you want to understand what Bernanke's frustrations are, then just read Friedman. They're the same thing. Friedman says it. Bernanke can't. Why? Because the political muscle at this point of the highly concentrated wealth is such that they don't believe they need to slow down this juggernaut. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting of a corporate board of directors where half of the corporate board of directors usually about 15 to 20 people. So half of them are saying, look, we have cut wages, we have cut benefits. These workers don't do anything. They cut some more. What's the problem? There's a lot of noise, but they don't do anything. They're worried about their job. You know, I've never known it before. We're just as loyal to the company as the first one, who say, don't keep pushing, because one day you'll push too far.
little bit weird, but fuck it.
Which are many, by sticking it to their employees one way or another, and they think they can do it. At this point, they think they could have a crisis, they could get the government to save them, and they could make it. That's what they think. And they're the majority, and they're not going to stop. They can't get over the idea. They expected, many of them, that when this crisis hit, they would have to give up things because they were culpable.
Oh, yeah.
From being a flaw of capitalism that they're going to have to pay for into a flaw of unions that they can stick it to.
Professor Wolf here is very wise, by the way.
I've been with them.
The plug that.
You had one too
Professor
many.
Richard Wolf.
Very, very funny. You know, every joke, however old and tired, wakes you up. For these people, they're in a moment, they're just taken with it, and they don't want the people to accept cutbacks instead of taxing them. They've never seen before. They're not paying any taxes. They have 86,000 ways even to get out of the low rates that they face. Nobody's saying boo about it. Everybody's discussing who do we stop? Should we take all of the remaining money away from the national public about this? Or give a few more bucks to Planned Parenthood? They don't care about. By the way, the majority of these people support Planned Parenthood. They're not right-wing people. They're not. That's a mistake. They hate the Tea Party. I can't repeat in his audience the words.
Risky, but you know what I'm doing again.
Wall Street. They think those people are afraid of people. Ireland Spring. They're afraid. That's really the answer. They can't stop this. They're afraid of how far this is going to go. We are now a country, for those of you that haven't noticed, I'm sure nobody, we're now entering the fourth war against Muslim countries. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya. You got it. But you're on a roll of a certain sort. The way it works, it seems you got to do this, and then you suddenly any of these things. They're convinced they can now weather it. Let the bubble in securitized student loans or securitized auto loans. Let the bubble burst, which it very well may. A lot of people are saying that it's coming. They're just convinced they will get another bailout of the bubble because that's what Americans do.
We have socialism for the wealthy. That's true. The bailouts we gave big business would have fed, clothed, and housed everyone.
To find yourself in the middle of a global crisis that the public employees in the state of Wisconsin probably had relatively little to do with, and to go after them as the great problem. It's an extraordinary achievement of our political system to determine. And I think that folks like Bernanke, they understand this. And they're nervous, very nervous about it. But they're in the political world as Washington is a political world sustained by the world. Put yourself in the situation. If you enjoy the moment. Imagine you were one of these bosses just a week. And you understood, because your accountant explained to you, that you were now worth $300 million, and you were part of a charmed circle, and there were a lot of you in America.
That was a disturbed garden.
Is shape the culture of this society so that you're not positioned as the bad guy. still have the right of the mass voting. Don't bring in the people who they would then want to take away from you. This is not, rocket science here. So you move into the political sphere. Faced with flat wages, turned in on themselves, turned away from politics. They did. There's that wonderful book I always recommend for those of you that are quick readers. A Harvard professor in sociology wrote a book with a title you'll never forget. It was funny. It's called Bowling Alone. But the thing about Bowling Alone is he studied Americans who stopped participating in public affairs, who stopped going out with friends, who stopped being in a bowling league so that when they went bowling, they went bowled alone because they weren't with anybody. That withdrawal of the American working class as it did all this work and took on all this debt and got stressed out.
Motherfucker.
Transformations we've been talking about. When political life and participation in all those urban political made them out. The very money they were creating at the top moved in because it's needed now to control the political situation because it's hard to keep a system like this. Look at the fascination of the United States with Egypt and the wealth of Mubarak against the poverty of the masses. My wife decided to therapist. The first thing she said is Americans are all projecting. They can't talk about it at home, so they're fascinated when it's somewhere really far away. It was her way of realizing this extraordinary, intense engagement with a country whose name you can't spell. What is that? Because it's a morality play. It's like a drama that you see yourself reflected.
Just one more short question. Sorry.
You mentioned the problem with Oregon, and no one knows about what happened there. The corporate press.
Man, I ended up with the manhole, right? Shit.
I would wonder if you could tell us something about all the social benefits that are in Europe and those advanced Western countries that you spoke about. They never talk about the things that those people have. And I was wondering how you can help us to find out what they have in Norway, and France, and Italy, and all those social benefits that people have, as well as
he didn't have a lot of mana. I just made him mill of mana.
going the way of the dodo bird.
He got one anyway.
Replacing it with the 401k and 403b.
Right.
And I'd like you to speak about that and the possibility of having the people with you to jump in that process. Thank you.
All those things exist.
Wait, what? How does...
And the way to learn about it is to make
How did he...
technology
How could I not just block? Did I have flying on it? What?
Is a wonderful thing. It's very quick. Do your little Google game and find out what the social benefits or social welfare system is in France or Italy or Germany or Sweden. It's not hard to do, but let me give you just a taste. The law in France. The minute you go to work, after you finish your high school or college, you have a paid job. Your employer is required by law to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation. That's the law. Let me just repeat that. The law in France is you must get 5 weeks paid vacation. Try to think. Most Americans will not get 5 weeks paid vacation. But if they're lucky, maybe in the last 18 months, the employer, in addition to giving you a cheap watch, will give you such a vacation, but probably not. Let me give you another example. Public health. Every one of the European countries has a national public health program. They produce health outcomes that are better than those in the United States, longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality, and all the rest.
Good thing I got my head in while I could.
Much less money per person on their health care with better outcomes. Anyone looking at this will be able to say, goodness gracious, something approximating what all these other countries do. It is possible, if you listen to the AMA and other groups in the United States, to conclude that our system is much, much better than theirs. And that would require you then to conclude as well that everybody over there is a raving moron. Because Sarkozy, who, by the way, it's a name for you not to remember. The people of France and their attitude towards him, he's in worse shape than Mr. Bush in his worst moments was. And that's saying a lot. And right behind him, heading into the toilet, is Mrs. Merkel in the Germany next door. And those are the two key countries. And both of them are being defeated.
I need to replace that card.
Against austerity. That's what's driving them out. And so, very different situations. The public health service, that was extraordinary. I know France best because my family's part of French. When you have a child, the government will send a person to work with you for the first 4 or 5 years. You don't have to have them, but it's a government service. They will teach you caring for the baby and everything else, but they will give you time. When I taught in France for a while as a visiting professor at the University of Paris, and my colleagues who brought me there as a visiting professor had at that time she was about 7, and he was an economics professor like I at the university. And they could bring her as early as 7 o'clock in the morning and pick her up as late as 7 in the evening, or any period within that they wanted. She had her own outfit that the school the daycare center provided at the school. After school programs for her and so forth. And she paid the family. That's across the city. A level of public services that is completely different. You also ought to understand, for some of you don't get this, that in France there are no private universities. The university system is private.
Gigi, yeah, man. 2 out of 3. Let's get that last one now.
And they look at you as if you're nuts. And they explain. If you have private as well as public, then you have a 2-track system. It's unequal. And we know that would be undemocratic.
I got bad luck in that. That was bad luck. I've been kicking ass, though.
Also, to go to a public school, to go to the University of Paris, costs you the lofty sum of $200 a year. Now, to be fair, they don't have the kind of vast university system that we do, so a much smaller percentage of college-age people go to the university. So it's not, their program is free, basically, for students, but it doesn't take in anywhere near the size that we do. Well, but then again, what we call university, they do, well, it's true. If you know what their system is, they do advance the level. To do that is to do the equivalent of what we do here in the first couple of years. It's a much more, many more social benefits than you have. Yes, the war. And in Germany, let me give you some examples in Germany. You can see from your faces, you're interested. This gentleman asked a very important question. In Germany, a factory cannot leave a community. A factory cannot leave a community. In order for a factory to shut down and move to another place, it has to get a vote of approval from the trade union and a vote of approval from the community where it exists. If it leaves without doing that, its property is seized by the government. The criminal act. Another example. If you have more than 2,000 employees in Germany, half the board of directors have to be workers. Now, these are not, they're still capitalist societies, but you sense right away the power of mass organizations, trade unions, socialist parties, and communist. There's also green parties, which are strong in these countries, and a new thing, parties that are called anti-capitalist. For instance, 2 of them. Germany's most amazing new political party is a party called the Left. Die Linke. In German, that's what the left means. They got 12 12% of the vote in the last national election, 1 out of 8 women voted for them. And here's their slogan: Germany can do better than capitalism.
Ah, nigga.
All these countries have information about themselves, or you can learn about all of this and how they work. It's a remarkable story there of, even within capitalism, the conditions of life of working people will be very different if they have organizations.
Only card I got in there.
Than if they don't. And there are
Oh.
When I was a professor in France, I remember once an effort was made by a conservative government in the middle 1990s to reduce, I forgot to mention it, reduce the subsidy for children. In France, if you have a second, third, fourth, fifth child, you get money for each extra child. You get direct cash. Everybody gets it. It's just to help you with large families. You all got that? Good. 50 years ago.
Keep it from alive. I shouldn't have attacked the other one.
Slightly reduce the support for large families.
Stacking.
And there was a demonstration that came out of the hotel where I was being put up.
Is this deck monocolor? Ooh, fucking niggers. Niggers. I could have fucking took out his wall. Nigger. Mana. I should have mulliganed.
And they were carrying big banners about how power sink, whatever it was against the government wing. And they were carrying and shaking behind them, which was the Communist Party officials of that district. And they were all friends. And they were in this demonstration together. 2 days later, the government withdrew the bill. What are you going to do? Every French family has got somebody who's a socialist or a communist in it. You can't see what America is. Because that evil communist can't believe. The one who comes to the picnic and hands leaflets between the sandwiches. That's what you do. You can't do it. And you should remember, by the way, that the politics in France and Europe are very strange. The government pushing austerity in Greece is the government of the Socialist Party. Yorgos Papandreou, the long socialist party. His grandfather was the prime minister of Greece. His father was the prime minister of Greece. These are socialists doing the austerity and being pushed back. In the government that fell in Portugal that I told you about before, that fell last week. The name of the prime minister, you'll love this, is Jose Socrates, like the Greek. Jose Socrates was prime minister of the Socialist Party, thrown out of office by an alliance of the communists and the conservatives. So that's another sign that the conventional world that we've all been living in for a long time is coming to an end. Last point, I know we've run out of time. We used to have pensions where the whole point of the pension was to say, if you give a lifetime of work to
niggers, one health, maybe. Fucking niggers.
And we, the employer, are going to guarantee that between the money, which is your money that we've taken, and how we've invested it, you have a guarantee. You will be taken care of in a decent way in your old age, and you will not be a burden on your children. That was the whole thing. And so now the big fight, they won our pensions. Social Security.
Okay, let me.
The Great Depression gave people a real good benefit. In this depression, we're taking things away from people. Okay? The difference. What's happening now is that the business community doesn't want that because they don't want to be stuck with the obligation in case their investments didn't turn out real good with your money they don't want to have to pay you off in the way that you had been promised. So what they do now is they say, we'll take your money, but what you get depends on how well the investment in the stock market goes. That means your future life as a retired person becomes a crapshoot. You're now a gambler with your own future. You'll do nicely if the stock market goes up, and you'll be in deep doo-doo if it doesn't. That's not a commitment to people that comes out of honoring their lifetime of work. That's making
Oh, I got new.
gamble about their own future. And the irony here is that younger people don't think that's their issue. But it is your issue. Because if your parents are not able to take care of themselves when they're old, either you're going to be a monster and dump them in a nursing home, well, that's an option. A lot of people take that option. Or you're going to have to take your own difficult situation and help them. And that, it was to avoid the tension and the pain inside families to create an tension, and that is being taken away because over the last 3 years, it's not much discussed, there's been a massive change away from defined benefit. You get a certain defined benefit to defined contribution. What's defined is how much you put in, but it's an open question, how much you get out. And that, again, is an assault on the working class of the country. So think about this uncut movement. It's one of many movements that's happening around the United States where people really are interested in these questions,
A little
changing
RNG
their
in
minds,
here.
beginning to think about getting active. Things are going to change in the United States, and we need you to be part of that. Thank you again very much.
The following is a conversation with Stephen Wolfram, his third time on the podcast. He's a computer scientist, mathematician, theoretical physicist, and the founder of Wolfram Research, a company behind Mathematica, Wolfram Alpha, Wolfram Language, and the new Wolfram Physics project. This conversation is a wild, technical roller coaster ride through topics of complexity, mathematics, physics, computing, and consciousness. I think this is what this podcast is becoming, a wild ride. Some episodes are about physics, some about robots, some are about war and power, some are about the human condition and our search for meaning, and some are just what the comedian Tim Dillon calls fun. This is the Lex Friedman Podcast. To support it, please check out the sponsors in the description. And now, here's my conversation with Stephen Wolfram. Almost 20 years ago, you published A New Kind of Science, where you presented a study of complexity and an approach for modeling of complex systems. So, let us return again to the core idea of complexity. What is complexity?
I don't know, I think that's not the most interesting question. It's like, if you ask a biologist, what is life?
Yeah.
That's not the question they care the most about. What I was interested in is, how does something that we would usually identify as complexity arise in nature? And I got interested in that question like 50 years ago, which is really embarrassingly a long time ago. And, I was... how does snowflakes get to have complicated forms? How do galaxies get to have complicated shapes? How do living systems get produced? Things like that. And the question is, what's the sort of underlying scientific basis for those kinds of things? And the thing that I was at first very surprised by, because I've been doing physics and particle physics and fancy mathematical physics and so on. And it's like, I know all this fancy stuff. I should be able to solve this sort of basic science question. And I couldn't. This was like early, maybe 1980-ish time frame. And it's like, okay, what can one do to understand this sort of basic secret that nature seems to have. It seems like nature, you look around in the natural world, it's full of incredibly complicated forms. You look at sort of most engineered kinds of things, for instance, they tend to be, we got sort of circles and lines and things like this. And the question is, what secret does nature have that lets it make all this complexity that we, in doing engineering, for example, don't naturally seem to have? And so that was the kind of the thing that I got interested in. And then the question was, could I understand that with things like mathematical physics? Well, it didn't work very well. So then I got to thinking about, okay, is there some other way to try to understand this? And then the question was, if you're going to look at some system in nature, how do you make a model for that system, for what that system does? So, a model is some abstract representation of the system, some formal representation of the system. What is the raw material that you can make that model out of? And so what I realized was, well, actually programs are a really good source of raw material for making models of things. And, in terms of my personal history, to me that seemed really obvious. And the reason it seemed really obvious is because I just spent several years building this big piece of software that was sort of a predecessor to Mathematica and Wolfram Language, thing called SMP, Symbolic Manipulation Program, which was something that had this idea of starting from just these computational primitives and building up everything one had to build up. And so kind of the notion of, well, let's just try and make models by starting from computational primitives and seeing what we can build up, that seemed like a totally obvious thing to do. In retrospect, it might not have been externally quite so obvious, but it was obvious to me at the time, given the path that I happened to have been on. So, so that got me into this question of, let's use programs to model what happens in nature. And the question then is, well, what kind of programs? And, we're used to programs that you write for some particular purpose, and it's a big long piece of code, and it does some specific thing. But what I got interested in is, okay, if you just go out into this sort of computational universe of possible programs,
what I do.
Take the simplest program you can imagine, what does it do? And so I started studying these things called cellular automata. Actually, I didn't know it because they were called cellular automata.
One card. Is either impermissible or one I don't have.
Each one is black or white. And it's just some rule that says the color of this cell is determined by the color that it had on the previous step and its two neighbors on the previous step. And
I have the setting on.
That's, sufficiently simple setup. It's not going to do anything interesting. It's always going to be simple, no complexity, simple rules, simple behavior. Okay, but then I actually ran the computer experiment, which was pretty easy to do. It probably took a few hours originally, and the results were not what I'd expected really. Now, needless to say, in the way that science actually works, the results that I got had a lot of unexpected things which I thought were really interesting, but the really strongest result, which was already right there in the printouts I made, I didn't really understand for a couple more years. So it was not, the compressed version of the story is you run the experiment and you immediately see what's going on, but I wasn't smart enough to do that, so to speak. But the big thing is, even with very simple rules of that type, sort of the minimal, tiniest program, sort of the one-line program or something, it's possible to get very complicated behavior. My favorite example is this thing called Rule 30, which is a particular cellular automaton rule. You just start it off in one black cell, and it makes this really complicated pattern. And so that, for me, was sort of a critical discovery that then kind of said, playing back onto, how does nature make complexity? I sort of realized that might be how it does it. That might be kind of the secret that it's using, is that in this kind of computational universe of possible programs, it's actually pretty easy to get programs where, even though the program is simple, the behavior when you run the program is not simple at all. And that was, so for me, that was the kind of the story of kind of how that was sort of the indication that when he got an idea of what the sort of secret that nature uses to make complexity, and how complexity can be made in other places. Now, if you say, what is complexity? Complexity is, it's not easy to tell what's going on. That's the informal version of
it's not easy to know what.
Right.
Well, no, the rules can generate randomness, right?
Well, that's not obvious. In other words,
that's not obvious. That's
it's
right.
not obvious at all.
Right.
And it wasn't what I expected. It's not what people's intuition had been and has been for a long time. That is, one might think you have a rule, you can tell there's a rule behind it. I mean, it's just like, the early, robots in science fiction movies. Like, you can tell it's a robot because it does simple things. Right? It turns out that isn't actually the right story, but it's not obvious that isn't the right story. So people assume simple rules, simple behavior. And that was sort of the key discovery about the computation universe was that it's true. And that discovery goes very deep and relates to all kinds of things that I've spent years and years studying. That that in the end, the sort of the what is complexity is, well, you can't easily tell what it's going to do. You could just run the rule and see what happens, but you can't just say, show me the rule, great, and now I know what's going to happen. And the key phenomenon around
come on, it's been so stable.
Reducibility, this fact that in something like Rule 30, you might say, well, what's it going to do after 1 million steps? Well, you can run it for 1 million steps and just do what it does to find out, but you can't compress that, you can't reduce that and say, I'm going to be able to jump ahead and say, this is what it's going to do after 1 million steps, but I don't have to go through anything like that computational effort.
By the way, has anybody succeeded at that? You had a challenge, a competition.
Right.
For predicting the middle column of Rule 30. Anybody?
A number of people have sent things in, and sort of people are picking away at it, but it's hard. I mean, I've been actually even proving that the center column of Rule 30 doesn't repeat. That's something I think might be doable.
It's been pretty stable, man. I guess I can't. Oh, here we go.
Which are also generated in this very deterministic way. And so the question is, how random are the digits?
I didn't get the play card.
The digits of pi ever repeat? Well, we know they don't. Because we've proved in the 1800s.
You're doing his turn.
So we know the digits of pi don't repeat. So now the question is, does 0, 1, 2, 3 or whatever, do all the digits base 10 or base 2 or however you work it out, do they all occur with equal frequency? Nobody knows. That's far away from what can be understood mathematically at this point. And that's kind of, but I'm even looking for step 1, which is that the center column doesn't repeat. And then prove other things about it, like equidistribution of equal numbers of zeros and ones. And those are things which I kind of set up this little prize thing because I thought those were not too out of range. Those are things which are within, a modest amount of time. It's conceivable that those could be done. They're not far away from what mathematics might allow. They'll require a bunch of cleverness and hopefully some interesting new ideas that will be useful other places.
But you started in 1980 with this idea before I think you realized this idea of programs. You thought that there might be some kind of...
How did I skip my turn? Oh, man.
That you kind of spaghetti or something. You filter the randomness and outcomes complexity, which is an interesting intuition. And how do we know that's not actually what's happening? So just because you require one people to develop, you don't need this incredible randomness. You can just have very simple, predictable initial conditions and predictable rules, and then from that emerge complexity. Still, there might be some systems where it's filtering randomness on the inputs.
Well, the point is, when you have quotes randomness in the input, that means there's all kinds of information in the input. Yeah. And in a sense, what you get out will be maybe just something close to what you put in. Like people are very in dynamical systems theory, sort of big area of mathematics that developed from the early 1900s and really got big in the 1980s. An example of what people study there a lot, and its popular version is chaos theory. An example of what people study a lot is the shift map, which is basically taking 2x mod 1, the fractional part of 2x, which is basically just taking digits in binary. So at every step, you get to see, if you say, how big is this number that I got out? Well, the most important digit in that number is whatever ended up at the left-hand end. But now if you start off from an arbitrary random number, which is quotes randomly chosen, so all its digits are random, then when you run that shift map, all that you get out is just whatever you put in. You just get to see it's not obvious that you would excavate all of those digits. And if you're, for example, making a theory, I don't know, fluid mechanics, for example, if there was that phenomenon in fluid mechanics, then the equations of fluid mechanics can't be right. Because what that would be saying is the equations of that it matters to the fluid what happens in the fluid at the level of the millionth digit of the initial conditions, which is far below the point at which you're hitting kind of sizes of molecules and things like that. It's kind of almost explaining if that phenomenon is an important thing, kind of telling you that the fluid dynamics, which describes fluids as continuous media.
Oh shit!
So this idea that it's a tricky thing because as soon as you put randomness in, you have to
have 8. He conceded. He gave up.
How much is actually something that's being generated? And what's really nice about these systems where you just have very simple initial conditions and where you get random stuff out or seemingly random stuff out is you don't have baddassery. You don't have to argue about was there something complicated put in, because it's plainly obvious there wasn't. Now, as a practical matter in doing experiments, the big thing is if the thing you see is complex and reproducible, then it didn't come from just filtering some, quotes, randomness from the outside world. It has to be something that is intrinsically made, because it wouldn't otherwise be. I mean, it could be the case that you set things up and it's always the same each time, and you say, well, it's kind of the same, but it's not random each time, because kind of the definition of it being random is it was kind of picked at random each time, so to speak.
So is it possible to for sure know
like the
that our
Dungeons and
universe
Dragons
does
ones.
not at the fundamental level have randomness? Is it possible to conclusively say there's no randomness at the bottom?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, science, natural science is an inductive business, right? You observe a bunch of things and you say, can we fit these together? What is our hypothesis for what's going on? The thing that I think I can say
Unexpected
fairly
windfall.
definitively is at this point we understand enough about fundamental physics that if there was sort of an extra
Is that a
dice
mythic
being
rare,
thrown,
like by itself?
something that doesn't need to be there. We can get what we see without that. Now, add that in as an extra little featureoid, without breaking the universe, probably. But almost certainly yes. But is it necessary for understanding the universe? No. And I think actually from a more fundamental point of view, I think I might be able to argue. So one of the things that I've been interested in, been pretty surprised that I've had anything sentient to say about, is the question of why does the universe exist? I didn't think that was a question that I would, I thought that was a far out there metaphysical kind of thing. Philosophers have stayed away from that question for the most part. It's such a kind of, difficult to address question. But I actually think, to my great surprise, that from my physics project concerned, that it is possible to actually address that question and explain why the universe exists. And I kind of have a suspicion, I've not thought it through, I kind of have a suspicion that explanation will eventually show you that in no meaningful sense can there be randomness underneath the universe. That is, that if there is, it's something that is necessarily irrelevant to our universe. That is, it doesn't matter. Because in a sense, we've already, whatever it would do, whatever extra thing it would add, is not relevant to our perception of what's going on.
So why does the universe exist? How does the irrelevance of randomness connect to the big why question?
So I mean, why does the universe exist? Well, let's see.
And is this the only universe?
Yeah, it's the only one. About that, I'm pretty sure.
So now, maybe which of these topics is better to enter first? Why does the universe exist, and why you think it's the only one that exists?
Well, I think they're very closely related. Okay. So I mean, the first thing, let's see. I mean, this "why does the universe exist" question is built on top of all these things that we've been figuring out about fundamental physics. Because if you want to know why the universe exists, you kind of have to know what the universe is made of. And I think let me describe a little bit about the why does the universe exist question. So the main issue is, let's say you have a model for the universe. and you say, I've got this program or something, and you run it, and you make the universe. Now you say, well, why is that program actually running? When people say, you've got this program that makes the universe, what computer is it running on? Right? What does it mean? What actualizes something? 2 plus 2 equals 4, but that's different from saying there's a pile of 2 rocks and another pile of 2 rocks, and somebody glues them together and makes 4, so to speak. And so what is it that kind of turns it from being just this formal thing to being something that is actualized? Okay, so there we have to start thinking about, well, what do we actually know about what's going on in the universe? Well, we are observers of this universe, but confusingly enough, we're part of this universe. So in a sense, if we say, what do we know about what's going on in the universe? Well, what we know is what sort of our consciousness records about what's going on in the universe.
And so consciousness is part of the universe, so we're in it.
Yes, we're in it. And maybe I should start off by saying something about the consciousness story, because that's
maybe we should begin even before that, at the very base layer of the Wolfram Physics Project. Maybe you can give a broad overview once again, really quick, about this hypergraph model.
Yes.
And also, what is it, a year and a half ago, this project to the world? What is the status update? What are all the beautiful ideas you have come across? What are the interesting things you can mention?
It's a frigging Cambrian explosion. It's crazy. There are all these things which I've kind of wondered about for years, and suddenly there's actually a way to think about them. And I really did not see, the real strength of what's happened, I absolutely did not see coming. And the real strength of it is, we've got this model for physics, but it turns out it's a foundational kind of model. That's a different kind of computation-like model that I'm kind of calling this a multi-computation.
Motherfucker.
And that kind of model is applicable not only to physics, but also to lots of other kinds of things. And one reason that's extremely powerful is because physics has been very successful. So we know a lot based on what we figured out in physics. And we know that the same model governs physics and governs, economics, linguistics, immunology, whatever. We know that the same model governs those things. We can start using things that we've successfully discovered in physics and applying those intuitions in all these other areas. And that's pretty exciting and very surprising to me. And in fact, it's kind of like in the original story,
this ain't gonna work out.
Sort of go and explain why is there complexity in the natural world. Then you realize there's all this complexity, there's all this competition.
God, one more minute, then I can fucking.
It's kind of very confusing thing for people who say science has nailed everything down. We're going to, based on science, we can know everything. Well, actually, the computational thing right in the middle of that, thrown up by science, so to speak. And then the question is, given computational reducibility, how can we actually...
Should have played. No, I can't play it. Oh, man. Fuck.
Why are we able to predict anything? Why are we able to sort of operate in the world? And the answer is that we sort of computational reducibility exists in this kind of ocean of computational ability. And it turns out that seems it's a very fundamental feature of the kind of model that seems to operate in physics.
Alright,
Perhaps
take it. I'm not sure block that, but
that are relevant to us. And those are the things that both allow us to operate in the world and not just have everything be completely unpredictable, but they're also things that potentially give us what amount to sort of physics-like laws in all these other areas. So that's an interesting thing, but I would say that in general for us, it's kind of unspectacular.
oh fuck, I played the wrong one. No, fuck.
I was pretty sure that wasn't how things worked. And turns out I'm wrong.
I fucked up. This one has to attack. I could have made it fight with this one, and it would have killed it, and I would have been ahead.
So what's happened with the physics project?
Joy, here it comes.
The following question. So it's easy through words to describe how cellular automata works. You've explained this. And it's the fundamental mechanism by which you simulate what can be science, explore complexity, and how to do science in this world of reducible islands and irreducible, general irreducibility. Okay, so how does the model of hypergraphs differ from cellular automata, and how does the idea of multi-computation differ? Like, maybe that's a way to describe it.
All right, this is my life is, like all of our lives, something of a story of computational irreducibility.
Yes.
And, it's been going for
I've sacrificed all three to stop that one five.
Find these appropriate pockets of reducibility, but let me see what I can do. So I mean, first of all, let's talk about physics, first of all. And, a key observation, that one of the starting point of our physics project is things about what is space, what is the universe made of. And, ever since Euclid, people just sort of say space is just this thing where you can put things at any position you want. And they're just points, and they're just geometrical things that you can just arbitrarily put at different coordinate positions. So the first thing in our physics project is the idea that space is made of something. Just like water is made of molecules, space is made of kind of atoms of space. And the only thing you can say about these atoms of space is they have some identity. It's this atom as opposed to this atom. And, you could give them, if you were a computer person, you give them UIDs or something. That's all there is to say about them, so to speak. And then
Mostly,
we know
not
these atoms of space is how they relate to each other. So we say these three atoms of space are associated with each other in some relation. So you can think about that as,
oh, this adds +1 +1. I gotta remember that.
Space. You can build this essentially of space. And the sort of starting point of our physics project is that's what our universe is. It's a giant friend network of the atoms of space. And so how can that possibly represent our universe? Well, it's like in something like water, there are molecules bouncing around on a large scale that produces fluid flow, and we have fluid vortices, and we have all of these phenomena that are sort of the emergent phenomena from that underlying kind of collection of molecules bouncing around. And by the way, it's important that collection of molecules bouncing around have this phenomenon of computational irreducibility. That's actually what leads to the second dynamics. And that leads to the sort of randomness of the underlying behavior, which is what gives you something which on a large scale seems like it's a smooth, continuous type of thing. And so first thing is space is made of something. It's made of all these atoms of space connected together in this network. And then everything that we experience is sort of features of that structure of space. So, when we have an electron or something, or a photon, it's some kind of tangle in the structure of space. Much like kind of a vortex in a fluid would be just this thing that is, it can actually, the vortex can move around, it can involve different molecules in the fluid, but the vortex still stays there.
And if you zoom out enough, the vortex looks like an atom itself, like a basic atom.
Yes.
So there's the levels of abstraction. If you squint and kind of blur things out, it looks like abstraction. You can define what is a basic individual entity.
Yes, but in this model, there's a bottom level.
Yeah.
There's an elementary length. 10 to the minus 100 meters, let's say, which is really small. Proton is 10 to the minus 15 meters. The smallest we've ever been able to sort of see with a particle accelerator is around 10 to the minus 21 meters. So, if we don't know precisely what the correct scale is, but it's perhaps of the order of 10 to the minus 100 meters. But that's the end. That's what things are made of.
What's your intuition where the 10 to the minus 100 comes from? What's your intuition about this scale?
Well, okay, so there's a calculation which I consider to be somewhat rickety, okay, which has to do with comparing, so there are various fundamental constants. There's the speed of light. The speed of light, once you know the elementary time, the speed of light tells you the conversion from the elementary time to the elementary length. Then there's the question of how do you convert to the elementary energy, and how do you convert to between other things. And the various constants we know. We know the speed of light, we know the gravitational constant, We know Planck's constant and quantum mechanics. Those are the three important ones. And we actually know some other things. We know things like the size of the universe, the Hubble constant, things like that. And essentially this calculation of
Shred it
the
now.
elementary length comes from looking at these sort of combination of those. Okay, so the most obvious thing, people have sort of assumed that quantum gravity
There it goes.
happens at this thing, the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 34 meters, which is the sort of the combination of Planck's constant and the gravitational constant, the speed of light.
I need the earlier mana. We gotta
Turns out
mulligan more aggressively.
there's an additional round.
I have bonus cards to get mana fast.
Simultaneous threads of execution of the universe, which is essentially the number of sort of independent quantum processes that are going on. And that number, let's see if I remember that number. That number is 10 to the 170, I think, and so it's a big number. But that number then connects, sort of modifies what you might think from all these Planck units to give you the things we're giving. And there's been sort of a mystery actually there's a more technical physics thing that the Planck mass, the Planck energy is actually surprisingly big. The Planck length is tiny, 10 to the minus 34 meters. The Planck time, 10 to the minus 43 meters, I think, but seconds, I think. Is like the energy of a lightning strike. The actual elementary energy is that divided by the number of sort of simultaneous quantum threads, and it ends up being really small too. And that sort of explains that mystery that's been around for a while about how Planck units work. But the precise estimate is right. We don't know yet. I mean, that's one of the things that's sort of been a thing we've been pretty interested in. Is how do you see
Same
through,
thing. Do I take mana? Is 3 gonna be enough?
Microscope that can kind of see through to the atoms of space. How do you get in fluid flow, for example, if you go to hypersonic flow or something, you've got a Mach 20, space plane or something. It really matters that they're individual molecules hitting the space plane, not a continuous fluid. The question is, what is the analogous kind of, what is the analog of hypersonic flow for things about the structure of space-time? And it looks like a rapidly rotating black hole right at the sort of critical rotation rate it looks as if that's a case where essentially the structure of space-time is just about to fall apart. And you may be able to kind of see the evidence of sort of discrete elements, you may be able to kind of see there the sort of gravitational microscope of actually seeing these discrete elements of space. And there may be some effect in, for example, gravitational waves produced by rapidly rotating black hole. Some phenomenon where one can say, yes, they don't come out the way one would expect based on having a continuous structure of space-time. It is something where you can kind of see through to the discrete structure. We don't know that yet.
So can you maybe elaborate a little bit deeper how a microscope 100, how rotating black holes and presumably the detailed, accurate detection of gravitational waves can reveal the discreteness of space?
Thing is, what is a black hole? Actually, we need to go a little bit further in the story of what space-time is, because I explained a little bit about what space is.
Maybe if you less than that.
And that's sort of important in understanding space-time. So
in your sense, is both space and time in the story of this group?
Absolutely. And needless to say,
well, it's simple at the bottom.
It's very simple at the bottom. It's very, in the end, it's simple but deeply abstract. And something that is simple in conception, but kind of wrapping one's head around what's going on is pretty hard. But so first of all, we have this, I've described these kind of atoms of space and their connections. You can think about these things as a hypergraph. A graph is just nodes to nodes, but a hypergraph you can have, sort of not just friends, individual friends to friends, but you can have these triplets of friends or whatever else. And so we're just saying, and that's just the relations between atoms of space, the hyperedges of the hypergraph. And so we got some big of these atoms of space, maybe 10 to the 400 or something in our universe, and that's the structure of space. And every feature of what we experience in the world is a feature of that hypergraph, that spatial hypergraph. So then the question is, well, what does that spatial hypergraph do? Well, the idea is that there are rules that update that spatial hypergraph. And, in a cellular automaton, you've just got this line of cells, and you just say at every step, at every time step, you've got fixed time steps, fixed array of cells. At every step, every cell gets updated according to a certain rule. And that's kind of that's the way it works. Now, in this hypergraph, it's sort of vaguely the same kind of thing. We say every time you see a little piece of hypergraph that looks like this, update it to one that looks like this. So it's just keep rewriting this hypergraph. Every time you see something that looks like that anywhere in the universe, it gets rewritten. Now, one thing that's tricky about that, which we'll come to, is this multi-computational idea, which has to do with you're not saying in some kind of lockstep way, do this one, then this one, then this one. It's just whenever you see one you can do, you can go ahead and do it. And that leads one not to have a single thread of time.
Gotcha.
Because if you knew which one
the
to do,
negate.
just say, okay, do this one, then do
Very
this one,
critical.
then do this one. But if you say just do whichever one you feel like, you end up with these
That's basically a counterspell, but I believe the original counterspell was one more mana. Also blue though, and this is a rare card, special graphic.
Which is very uncomfortable for the human brain that seeks for things to be sequential and synchronous.
Right. Well, I think that this is part of the story of consciousness. Is I think the key aspect of consciousness that is important for sort of parsing is this point that we have a single thread of experience. We have a memory of what happened in the past. We can say something, predict something about the future, but there's a single thread of experience. And it's not obvious it should work that way. I mean, we've got 100 billion neurons in our brains, and they're all firing in all kinds of different ways. But yet, our experience is that there is this single thread of time that goes along. And I think that one of the things I've kind of realized with a lot more clarity in the last year is the fact that we conclude that the universe has the laws it has is a consequence of the fact that we have consciousness the way we have consciousness. And so I mean, just to go on with kind of the basic setup, so we've got this hypergraph, it's got all these atoms of space. They're getting these little clumps of atoms of space are getting turned into other clumps of atoms of space, and that's happening everywhere in the universe.
Two cards, you fucking niggers? Ooh.
There's nothing permanent in the universe. The universe is getting rewritten everywhere all the time. And if it wasn't getting rewritten, space wouldn't be knitted together. That is, space would just fall apart. There wouldn't be any way in which we could say this part of space is next to this part of space. One of the things that people were confused about back in antiquity, the ancient Greek philosophers, how does motion work? Can it be the case that you can take a thing that we can walk around and it's still us when we walk, a foot forward, so to speak? And in a sense, with our models, that's again a question, because it's a different set of atoms of space. When I move my hand, it's moving into a different set of atoms of space. It's having to be recreated. It's not, the thing itself is not there. It's being continuously recreated all the time. Now it's a little bit like waves in an ocean, vortices in fluid, which again, the actual molecules that exist in those are not what define the identity of the thing. But it's a little bit, there's this idea that there can be pure motion, that it is even possible for an object to just move around in the universe and not change. It's not self-evident that such a thing should be possible. And that is part of our perception of the universe, is that we parse those aspects of the universe where things like pure motion are possible. Now, pure motion, even in general relativity, the theory of gravity, pure motion is a little bit of a complicated thing. I mean, if you imagine your average, teacup or something approaching a black hole, it is deformed and distorted by the structure of space-time. And to say, is it really pure motion? That same teacup that's the same shape? Well, it's a bit of a complicated story. And this is a more extreme version of that. So anyway, the thing that's happening is we've got space, we've got this notion of time, So time is this rewriting of the hypergraph. And one of the things that's important about that, time is this sort of computationally irreducible process. There's something, time is not something where, in kind of the mathematical view of time, tends to be, time is just a coordinate. We can, slide a slider, turn a knob, and we'll change the time that we've got in this equation. But in this picture of time, that's not how it works at all. Time is this inexorable, irreducible kind of set of computations that go from where we are now to the future. But so the thing, and one of the things that is, again, something one sort of has to break out of is your average trained physicist like me says, space and time are the same kind of thing. They're related by, the Poincare group and Lorentz transformations and relativity and all these kinds of things. And, space and time, there are all these kind of sort of folk stories you can tell about why space and time are the same kind of thing. In this model, they're fundamentally not the same kind of thing. Space is this kind of sort of connections between these atoms of space. Time is this computational process. So the first sort of surprising thing is, well, it turns out you get relativity anyway. And the reason that happens, a few bits and pieces here which one has to understand, but the fundamental point is, if you are an observer embedded in the system that are part of this whole story of things getting updated in this way and that, there's sort of a limit to what you can tell about what's going on. And really, in the end, the only thing you can tell is what are the causal relationships between events. So an event in this sort of an elementary event is a little piece of hypergraph got rewritten. And that means that a few hyperedges of the hypergraph were consumed by the event, and you produce some other hyperedges. And that's an elementary event. And so then the question is, what we can tell is kind of what the network of causal relationships between elementary events is. That's the ultimate thing, the causal graph of the universe. And it turns out that, well, there's this property of causal invariance that is true of a bunch of these models, and I think is inevitably true for a variety of reasons, that makes it be the case that it doesn't matter, kind of, if you are sort of saying, well, I've got this hypergraph and I can rewrite this piece here and this piece here, and I do them all in different orders, when you construct the causal graph for each of those orders that you choose to do things in, you'll end up with the same causal graph. And so that's essentially why, that's in the end why relativity works. It's why our perception of space and time is having this kind of connection that relativity says they should have, and that's kind of how that works.
I'm missing a little piece. You can go there again.
Wait, what? That touch right? No, nigger.
In this hypergraph.
Yes, it did.
What is the observer not able to state about this universe?
Nigger.
You can say, oh, I see this particular place was updated, and then this one was updated, and I'm seeing which order things were updated in. But the observer embedded in the universe doesn't know which order things were updated in, because until they've been updated, they have no idea what else happened. So the only thing they know is the set of causal relationships. Let me give an extreme example. Let's imagine that the universe is a Turing machine. Turing machines have just this one update head which does something, and otherwise the Turing machine just does nothing, right? And the Turing machine works by having this head move around.
Oh, that touch you, right? Yes, it does. Oh,
The
niggas.
question is, could the universe be a Turing machine? Could the universe just have a single updating head that's just zipping around all over the place? You say that's crazy because
Got minutes too.
You seem to be updating.
No,
I'm
flying
updating,
death touch haste.
But the thing is, there's no way to know
Flying.
that, because if there was just this head moving around, it's like, okay, it updates me, but you're completely frozen at that point. Until the head has come over and updated you have no idea what happened to me.
Because he'll like
So
me block.
if you sort of unravel that argument, you realize the only thing we actually can tell is what the network of causal relationships between the things that happened were. We don't get to know from some sort of outside, sort of God's eye view of the thing. We don't get to know what, sort of from the outside, what happened. We only get to know sort of what the set of relationships between the things that happened actually were.
Yeah, but if I somehow record like a trace of this, I guess it would be called multi-computation. Can't I look back in the
Where do
cause
you
of tree.
record the trace?
You place throughout the universe, throughout a log that records in my own pocket in this hypograph. Can't I, realizing that I'm getting outdated pictures, can't I record?
See, the problem is, and this is where things start getting very entangled in terms of what one understands. The problem is that any such recording device is itself part of the universe. So you don't get to say, you never get to say, let's go outside the universe and go do this. And that's why, lots of the features of this model and the way things work end up being a result of that.
So, but what, I guess, on a human level, what is the cost we're paying? What are you missing from not getting an updated picture all the time? Okay, I understand what you're saying. Yeah. But how does consciousness emerge from that? What are the limitations of that observer? I understand you're getting a
So there's a bunch of limitations of the observer, I think. Maybe just explain something.
What? Niggers!
An extreme version of some of these issues, which helps to kind of motivate why one should sort of think things through a little bit more carefully. So one feature of this.
I gotta take
physics, like high school physics.
I'll play another match.
Equations of motion for a ball, and it says you throw the ball this angle, this velocity, things will move in this way, and there's a definite answer. Right? The key story of quantum mechanics is there aren't definite answers to where does the ball go. There's kind of this whole sort of bundle of possible paths, and all we say we know from quantum mechanics is certain probabilities for where the ball will end up. Okay, so that's kind of the core idea of quantum mechanics. So in our models, quantum mechanics is not some kind of plug-in add-on type thing. You absolutely cannot get away from quantum mechanics because as you think about updating this hypergraph, there isn't just one sequence of things, one definite sequence of things that can happen. There are all these different possible update sequences that can occur. You could do this, piece of the hypergraph now, and then this one later, etc., etc., etc. All those different paths of history correspond to these quantum paths in quantum mechanics, these different possible quantum histories. And one of the things that's kind of surprising about it is they branch. There can be a certain state of the universe, and it could do this or it could do that, but they can also merge. There can be two states of the universe. The next state they produce is the same. And that process of branching and merging is kind of critical, and the idea that there can be merging is critical and somewhat non-trivial for these hypergraphs because there's a whole graph isomorphism story and there's a whole very elaborate set of
That's
mathematics.
Where the causal invariance comes in.
Yes, among other things. Right. Okay. Yes, that's. But so. Okay, so we've got this thing that's branching, it's merging. The question is, how do we perceive that? Why don't we notice that the universe is branching and merging? Why is it the case that we just think a definite set of things happen? Well, the answer is we are embedded in that universe, and our brains are branching and merging too. And so, what quantum mechanics becomes a story of is what is a branching brain perceive a branching universe? And the key thing is, as soon as you say, I think definite things happen in the universe, that means you are essentially conflating lots of different paths of history. You're saying, actually, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm convinced that things happen in the universe, all these paths of history must be equivalent. Now, it's not obvious that that would be a consistent thing to do. It might be you say all these paths of history are equivalent. Maybe moments later, that would be a completely inconsistent thing with everything going to hell in different ways. If that doesn't happen, is what that's a consequence of this. And that, if that didn't happen at all, there wouldn't be anything that sort of is that quantum mechanics. It would be this bundle of cards. It's a little bit like what happens in statistical mechanics and coordinate where most of the time you see the continuous fluid. You just see the world that's progressing in this kind of way that's like this continuous fluid. But every so often, if you look at the exact right experiment, you can start seeing, well, actually, it's made of these molecules where they might go that way or they might go this way, and that's kind of quantum effects. And so this kind of idea
say we, do you mean the human brain in this specific?
Well, okay, so the human brain is where it starts, but we built a bunch of instruments that are a little bit better than the human brain, but they still have many of the same kinds of ideas. In there, they're not, at this point, we don't know how to make fundamentally qualitatively different sensory devices.
Right. So it's always just an extension of the conscious experience.
Sensory experience.
Sensory experience. Sensory experience is somehow intricately tied to consciousness.
Right. Well, so one question is, when we are looking at these molecules in gas and there might be 10 to 20 molecules in some little box or something, it's like, what do we notice about those molecules? So one thing that we can say is, we don't notice that much. We are, we can't go in and say, okay, there are 10 or 20 molecules and I know that I can sort of decrypt their motions and I can figure out this and that. It's like, I'm just going to say what the average sensitive molecules. And so one key feature of us is that we are computationally bounded. And that when you are looking at a universe which is full of computation and doing huge amounts of computation, but we are computationally bounded, there's only certain things about that universe that we're going to be sensitive to. We're not going to be figuring out what all the consciousness is. We are just computationally bounded observers, and we are only sampling these small set of features. So I think the two defining features of consciousness, and I would say that the preamble to this is, for years, as I've talked about sort of computation and fundamental features of physics and science, people ask me, so what about consciousness? And for years I've said, I have nothing to say about consciousness. I told this story when we talk about intelligence, about life. These are both features. You say, what's the abstract definition of life? We don't really know the abstract definition. We know the one for life on Earth. It's got RNA, it's got cell membranes, it's got similarly for intelligence. We know the human definition of intelligence, but what is intelligence abstractly? We don't really know. And so what I've long believed is that sort of the abstract definition of intelligence is just computational sophistication. As soon as you can be computationally sophisticated, consciousness is the top of the pile. But actually, I don't think it is. I think that there's this notion of kind of computational sophistication, which is the generalized intelligence. But consciousness has two limitations, I think. One of them is computational intelligence. That is that we're only receiving a sort of computationally bounded view of the universe. And the other is this idea of a single thread of time. That is, that we, in fact, we know go to some trouble to give us this one thread of attention, so to speak. And it isn't the case that, in all the neurons in our brains, that at least in our conscious, the correspondence of language, in our conscious experience, we just have this single thread of attention, single thread of perception. And maybe there's something unconscious that's bubbling around that's almost the quantum version of what's happening in our brain, so to speak. We've got the classical flow of what we are mostly thinking about, so to speak. But there's this kind of bubbling around of other parts. There's all those other neurons that didn't make it to be part of our sort of conscious stream of experience.
So in that sense, intelligence as computational sophistication is much broader than the computational constraints which consciousness operates under, and also the sequential thing. Yes, like the notion of time. That's kind of interesting. Then the follow-up question is like, okay, starting in the sense of what is intelligence, and how does that connect to a human brain? Because you're saying intelligence is almost like a fabric, like what we plug into it or something. Like
I think
our consciousness plugs into it.
Yeah, I mean, intelligence, I think, the core. Intelligence to some level is just a word, but you're asking, what is the notion of intelligence as we generalize it beyond the bounds of humans, beyond the bounds of even the AIs that we humans have built and so on. what is intelligence? Is the weather, people say the weather has a mind of its own. What does that mean? Can the weather be intelligent?
Yeah. What does agency have to do with intelligence? So is intelligence just like your conception of computation? Is intelligence is the capacity to perform computation and
Oh.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. And I think that, this question of is it for a purpose, okay, that quickly degenerates into a philosophical mess. Because, whenever you say, did the weather do that for a purpose? Right? Well, yes, it did. It was trying to move a bunch of hot air from the equator to the poles or something. That's its purpose.
But why? I seem to be equally as dumb today as I was yesterday, so there's some persistence, consistency over time that the intelligence has been into. So there's a hard constraint. Well, the amount of computation that can perform in that consciousness. Like, they seem to be really closely connected somehow.
Well, I think the point is that the thing that gives you kind of the ability to have kind of conscious intelligence, you can have kind of this. So one thing is we don't know intelligences other than the ones that are very much like us. Right? And the ones that are very much like us, I think, have this feature of single thread of time, bounded, computationally bounded. But you also need computational sophistication. Having a single thread of time and being computationally bounded, you could just do a clock going tick-tock. To deduce from this irreducible mess of what's going on in the physical world the laws of physics that we think exist. So in other words, if we say, why do we believe that there is, continuous space, let's say? Why do we believe that gravity works the way it does? Mm-hmm. Well, in principle, we could be kind of parsing details of the universe that were, that involve... Okay, the analogy is, again, with statistical mechanics and molecules in a box. We could be sensitive to every little detail of the swirling around of those molecules, and we could say what really matters is the wiggle effect.
Yes.
That is, that is something that we humans just never notice because it's some weird thing that happens when there are 15 collisions of air molecules and this happens and that happens.
You can see the pure motion of that.
Right. And
why do we see that?
Right. And the point is that what seems to be the case is that the things that, if we say, given this sort of hypergraph that's updating and all the details about all the sort of patterns of space and what they do, and we say, how do you slice that to what we can be sensitive to? What seems to be the case is that as soon as we assume, computational boundedness, single thread of time, that leads us to general relativity. In other words, we can't avoid that. That's the way that we will parse the universe. Given those constraints, we parse the universe according to those particular, in such a way that we say the aggregate reducible, pocket of computational reducibility that we slice out of this kind of whole computational irreducible ocean of behavior is just this one that corresponds to general relativity.
So we don't perceive general relativity.
Yeah, we do.
So you're saying perceive really doesn't.
Niggers.
That's a typical example of general relativity in action.
No, but what's the difference in that and Newtonian mechanics?
It doesn't. This is when I say general relativity, that's just
gravity.
The Uber theory, so to speak. Newtonian gravity is just the approximation that we can make, on the Earth and things like that. So this is, the phenomenon of gravity is one that is a consequence of. We would perceive something very different from gravity. So the way to understand that is we make up reference frames with which we parse what's happening in space and time. So, in other words, one of the things that we do is we say universe is like at the next. It's the reason we are used to doing that is because when we look around, we might see 10, 100 meters away. Or something, you would have a different perception. The speed of light would be much more important to us. We wouldn't have this perception that things happen progressively in time everywhere in space. And so that's an important reason that we kind of pass the universe in the way that causes us to say gravity works the way it does is because we're doing things like deciding that we can say the universe exists, space has a definite structure. There was a moment in time, space has a definite structure. We move to the next moment in time, space has another structure. That kind of setup is what lets us kind of deduce what to first the universe in such a way that we can say gravity works the way it does.
So that kind of reference frame is that the illusion of that is that
that's what consciousness does.
Sure.
In a sense, what consciousness is doing is it's
nigger should use it.
that the universe is kind of sequential. That is, and it is not allowing the possibility that there's multiple threads of time and they're all flowing differently. It's like saying no, everything is happening in this one thread of experience that we have.
And that illusion of that one thread of experience cannot happen at the same place. Are you saying typical human? Are you saying we are at a human level is special here for consciousness?
For our kind of consciousness, it's if we existed at a scale close to the elementary length, for example, then our perception of the universe would be absurdly different.
Okay, but this makes this consciousness seem like a weird concept for this particular scale. And so
is what can you imagine? What is a sort of factoring of something, what is some other possible way you could exist? And, if you were sort of, some kind of thing that was kind of, intelligence represented in terms of photons. For example, the photons we receive in the cosmic microwave background, those photons, as far as they're concerned, the universe just started. They were emitted 100,000 years after the beginning of the universe. They've been traveling at the speed of light. Time stayed still for them, and then they just arrived and we just detected them. So for them, the universe just started. And that's a different perception of, that has implications for a very different perception of time.
They don't have that single thread that seems to be really important for being able to tell a heck of a good story. So we humans
we can tell stories.
What other kind of stories can you tell us? So Photon is a really boring story.
So that's I don't know if they're a boring story, but I think it's, I've been wondering about this, and I've been asking, friends of mine who are science fiction writers and things, have you written stuff about this? And but one example, which I have to say, the books about that are very informed by a bunch of science that I've done, and the thing that I really loved about them was, in the first chapter of the book, the Earth is consumed by these things called nanots, which are nanobot type things, and so the Earth is gone in the first book. But that was only a microscope. It's only chapter one. It's not a real spoiler because it's such a complicated concept. But in the end,
problem is the middle of the night.
Saved by this thing.
The middle of the night, like only the fucking good people are playing. This is a little bit abnormal.
Read fiction books very often, and I was just thrilled. I get to
Niggers.
this, and it's like, oh my gosh, everything is saved by this sort of deep scientific principle.
Can you maybe elaborate how the principle of computational equivalence can save the planet?
That would be a terrible spoiler for me.
That would be a spoiler.
Let me see what the principle of computational equivalence is. So the question is, you have a a system, you have some rule, you can think of its behavior as corresponding to a computation. The question is, how sophisticated is that computation? The statement of the principle of computation equivalence is, as soon as it's not obviously simple, it will be as sophisticated as anything. And so that has the implication that, Rule 30, our brains, other things in physics, they're all ultimately equivalent in the computations they can do. And that's what leads to this computational reducibility idea, because the reason you don't get to jump ahead, and outthink Rule 30 is because we're just computationally equivalent to Rule 30. So we're kind of just running computations that are the same sort of the same level of computation, so to speak. So that's kind of the idea there. And the question, it's like in the science fiction version would be, okay, somebody says, we just need more servers. The way to get even more servers is turn the whole planet into a bunch of microservers. And that's where it starts. And so the question of, computational equivalence, principle of computational equivalence is, well, actually, you don't need to build those custom servers. Actually, you can just use natural computation to compute things, so to speak. You can use nature to compute. You don't need to have done all that engineering. It feels a little disappointing that you say, well, we build all this server, we're going to do all these things, we're going to make, maybe we're going to have human consciousness uploaded into, some elaborate digital environment. And then you look at that thing and you say, it's got electrons moving around, just like in a rock. And then you say, well, what's the difference? And computational says, there isn't, at some level, a fundamental, you can't say mathematically, there's a fundamental difference between the rock that is the future of human consciousness and a rock that's just a rock. Now, you sort of realize that this kind of consciousness thing is, there is an aspect of this that seems to be more special, that isn't, and for example, something I haven't really teased apart properly is when it comes to something like the weather and the weather having a mind of its own or whatever, or your average, pulsar magnetosphere acting like a sort of intelligent thing, how does that relate to, how is that entity related to the kind of consciousness that we have? And so what would the world look like, to the weather? If we think about the weather as a mind, what will it see? What will its laws of physics be? I don't really know.
It's very parallel.
It's very parallel, among other things, and it's not obvious. I mean, this is a really kind of mind-bending thing, because we've got to try and imagine where, we've got to try and imagine a parsing of the universe different from the one we have. And by the way, when we think about extraterrestrial intelligence and so on, I think that's kind of the key thing is, I've always assumed, okay, the extraterrestrials, at least they have the same physics. They've got the same physics. But actually, that's not really right, because the extraterrestrials could have a completely different way of parsing the universe. So it's as if, there could be, for all we know, right here in this room, in the details of the motion of these gas molecules, there could be an amazing intelligence that we were like, but we have no way of, we're not parsing the universe in the same way. If only we could parse the universe in the right way, immediately this amazing thing that's going on and this, huge culture that's developed and all that kind of thing would be obvious to us, but it's not, because we have our particular way of parsing the universe.
Would that thing also have agency? I don't know the right word to use, but something like consciousness, but a different kind of consciousness?
I think it's a question of just what you mean by the word, because I think that this notion of consciousness and so some people think of consciousness as sort of a key aspect of it is that we feel that there's sort of a feeling of that we exist in some way, that we have this intrinsic feeling about ourselves. I suspect that any of these things will also have an intrinsic feeling about themselves. I've been sort of trying to think recently about constructing an experiment about what if you were just a piece of a cellular automaton, let's say. What would your feeling about yourself actually be? And, can we put ourselves in the shoes, in the cells of the cellular automaton, so to speak? Can we get ourselves close enough to that we could have a sense of what the world would be like if you were operating in that way? And it's a little difficult because, you have to not only think about what are you perceiving, but also what's actually going on in your brain. And our brains do what they actually do. And they don't, it's, I think there might be some experiments that are possible with neural nets and so on, where you can have something where you can at least see in detail what's happening inside the system. And I've been sort of one of our projects to think about is there a way of kind of getting a sense kind of from inside the system about what its view of the world is and how it can we make a bridge? See the main issue is this. It's a sort of philosophically difficult thing because it's like we do what we do. We understand ourselves, at least to some extent. We humans understand ourselves. That's correct. But yet, okay, so what are we trying to do? For example, when we were trying to make a model of physics, what are we actually trying to do? Because, you say, well, can we work out what the universe does? Well, of course we can. We just watch the universe. The universe does what it does. But what we're trying to do when we make a model of physics is we're trying to get to the point where we can tell a story to ourselves that we understand that is also a representation of what the universe does. So it's this kind of, can we make a bridge between what we humans can understand in our minds and what the universe does? And in a sense, a large part of my kind of life efforts have been devoted to making computational language, which kind of is a bridge between what is possible in the computational universe and what we humans can conceptualize and think about. In a sense, when I built Wolfram language and our whole sort of computational language story, it's all about how do you take sort of raw computation in this ocean of computational possibility, and how do we sort of represent pieces of it in a way that we humans can understand and that map onto things that we care about doing. And in a sense, when you add physics, you're adding this other piece where we can, mediated by computer, can we get physics to the point where we humans can understand something about what's happening there? And when we talk about an alien intelligence, it's kind of the same story. It's like, is there a way of mapping what's happening there onto something that we humans can understand? And, physics, in some sense, is like our exhibit one of the story of alien intelligence. It's an alien intelligence in some sense. And what we're doing in making a model of physics is mapping that onto something that we understand. And I think, a lot of these other things that I've recently been kind of studying, whether it's molecular biology, other kinds of things, which we can talk about a bit, those are other cases where we're in a sense trying to, again, make that bridge between what we humans understand and sort of the natural language of that sort of alien intelligence in some sense.
When you're talking about, just to backtrack a little bit, about cellular automata, being able to, what's it like to be a cellular automata in the way that's equivalent to what is it like to be a conscious human being? How do you approach that? So is it looking at some subset of the cellular automata, asking questions of that subset, like how the world is perceived, how as that subset, like for that local pocket of computation, what are you able to say about the broader
something like,
and that somehow then can give you a sense of how to step outside of that cellular
right? But the tricky part is that little subset, what it's doing is it has a view of itself, and the question is, how do you get inside it? It's like, when we with humans, right? It's like we can't get inside each other's consciousness. That doesn't really, that doesn't really make sense. It's like there is an experience that somebody is having, but you can perceive them from the outside, but sort of getting inside it doesn't quite make sense. And for me, these sort of philosophical issues, and this one I have not untangled. So let's be for me, the thing that has been really interesting in thinking through some of these things is, when it comes to questions about consciousness or whatever else, it's like when I can run a program and actually see pictures and, make things concrete, I have a much better chance to understand what's going on than when I'm just trying to reason about things in a very abstract way.
Yeah, but there may be a way to map the program to your conscious experience. So, for example, you play a video game, you do a first-person shooter. You walk around inside this entity. It's a very different thing than watching this entity. So if you can somehow connect this full conscious experience to the subset of the cellular automata.
Yeah, it's something like that. But the difference in the first-person shooter thing is there's still your brain and your memory.
Nigger.
You still have. It's hard to. I mean, again, what one's going to get. One is not going to actually be able to be the cellular automaton. One's going to be able to watch what the cellular automaton does. But this is the frustrating thing. I'm trying to understand, how to think about being it, so to speak.
Okay, so like in virtual reality, there's a concept of immersion. Like with anything, with video game, with books, there's a concept of immersion. It feels like over time, if the virtual reality experience is well done, and maybe in the future it'll be extremely well done, the immersion leads you to feel like you forget that you even ever existed outside that experience.
Yeah,
so immersive. I mean, you could argue sort of mathematically that you can never truly become immersed, but maybe you can. I mean, why can't you merge with the cellular automata?
Yeah, right.
I mean, aren't you just part of the same fabric? Why can't you just like...
Well, that's a good question. I mean, so let's imagine the following
That's
scenario.
like epic, dude.
But then can you return back?
No, I'm stubborn. I have to
Let's
wait.
imagine you've uploaded, your brain is scanned, you've got... brain simulator, you upload the brain simulator, and the brain simulator is basically, some glorified cellular automaton. And then you say... That's another level. So there's the question. Actually, I do want to mention one thing because it's something I've realized in recent times, and I think it's really, really kind of cool, which is about time dilation and relativity, and it kind of helps to understand. It's something that kind of helps in understanding what's going on. So, according to relativity, if you have a clock that's ticking at a certain rate, you send it in a spacecraft that's going at some significant fraction of the speed of light. To you as an observer at rest, that clock that's in the spacecraft will seem to be ticking much more slowly. And so, in other words, it's kind of like the twin who goes off to Alpha Centauri.
I kind of get this, by the way. The relativistic. I kind of get it.
That is just hanging out where they're hanging out. Okay, why does that happen? Okay, so it has to do with what motion is. So, in our models of physics, what is motion? Well, when you move from somewhere to somewhere, you're having to sort of recreate yourself at a progress and you just evolve with time, you're updating yourself, you're following these rules to update what happens. Well, so the question is, when you have a certain amount of computation in you, so to speak, when there's a certain amount, you're computing, the universe is computing at a certain rate, you can either use that computation sitting still where you are, what's going to happen successively in time, or you can use that computation to recreate yourself as you move around the universe. And so time dilation ends up being, it's really cool actually, that this is explainable in a way that isn't just imagine the mathematics of it. But time dilation is a story of the fact that as you kind of are recreating yourself as you move, you are using up some of your computation. And so you don't have as much computation left over to actually work out what happens progressively with time. And so that means that time is running more slowly for you because it is you're using up your computation. Your clock can't tick as quickly because every tick of the clock is using up some computation, but you already used that computation up on moving at half the speed of light or something. And so that's why time dilation happens. And so it's kind of interesting that one can sort of get an intuition about something like that, because it has seemed like just a mathematical fact about the mathematics of special relativity and so on.
For me, it's a
Niggers!
that picture is you're using up computation.
Okay, so we're simply saying the entity is updating itself according to the way that the universe updates itself. And the question is, those updates, let's imagine the U is a clock. Okay? And the clock is, there's all these little updates, the hypergraph, and a sequence of updates cause the pendulum to swing back the other way, and then swing back and forth. Okay? And all of those updates are contributing to the motion of the pendulum going back and forth, or the oscillator moving, whatever it is. Okay? But then the alternative is that's sort of situation one where the thing is at rest. Situation two where it's kind of moving, what's happening is it is having to recreate itself at every moment. The thing is going to have to do the computations to be able to sort of recreate itself at a different position in space. And that's kind of the intuition behind. So it's either going to spend its computation recreating itself at a different position in space, or it's going to spend its computation doing the doing the updating of the ticking of the clock.
So the more updating is doing, the less the ticking of the clock update is doing.
That's right. The more it's having to update because of motion, the less it can update the clock. So that's obviously there's a sort of mathematical version of it that relates to how it actually works in relativity. That's kind of, to me, that was sort of exciting to me that it's possible to have a really mechanically explainable story that isn't similarly in quantum mechanics. This notion of branching brains perceiving branching universes, to me, that's getting towards a sort of mechanically explainable version of what happens in quantum mechanics, even though it's a little bit mind-bending to see, these things about under what circumstances can you successfully mix together those different threads of history, and when do things sort of escape, and those kinds of things. But the thing about this physical space, the main sort of big theory is general relativity, the theory of gravity, and that tells you how things move in physical space. In branchial space, the big theory is time and path integral, which it turns out tells you essentially how things move in the space of quantum phases. So it's kind of like motion in branchial space. And it's kind of a fun thing to start thinking about what all these things that we know in physical space, like event horizons and black holes and so on. What are the analogous things in branchial space? For example, the speed of light. What's the analog of the speed of light in branchial space? It's the maximum speed of quantum entanglement. So the speed of light is a flash bulb goes off here. What's the maximum rate at which the effect of that flash bulb is detectable moving away in space? So similarly in branchial space, something happens, and the question is, how far in this branchial space, in the space of quantum states, how far away can that get within a certain period of time? And so there's this notion of maximum entanglement speed, and that might be observable. That's the thing we've been sort of poking at, is might there be a way to observe it even in some atomic physics kind of situation? Because one of the things that's weird in quantum mechanics is, when we study quantum mechanics, we mostly study it in terms of small numbers of particles. You know, this electron does this thing on an ion trap does that, and so on. But when we deal with large numbers of particles, kind of all bets are off. It's kind of too complicated to deal with quantum mechanics. And so what ends up happening is, so this question about maximum entanglement speed and things like that may actually play in one of these quantum mechanics. And I even have some suspicions about things that might happen even in one of the things I realized I never understood, and it's kind of embarrassing, but I think I now understand a little better, is when you have chemistry and you have quantum mechanics, it's like, well, there's two carbon atoms, there's this molecule, and we draw a diagram, and we say this carbon atom ends up in this place. And it's like, but wait a minute, in quantum mechanics, nothing ends up in a definite place. There's always just some wave function for this to happen. How can it be the case that we can draw these reasons that just end up in this place? And you have to kind of say, well, the environment of the molecule effectively made a bunch of measurements on the molecule to keep it kind of classical. And that's a story that has to do with this whole thing about measurements have to do with this idea of, can we conclude that something definite happened? Because in quantum mechanics, the intrinsic quantum mechanics, the mathematics of quantum mechanics is all about, they're just these amplitudes for different things to happen. Then there's this thing of, and then we make a measurement, and we conclude that something definite happened. And that has to do with this thing, I think, about sort of about knitting together these different threads of history and saying, this is now something where we can definitively say something definite happened. In the traditional theory of quantum mechanics, it's just like, after you've done all this amplitude computation, then this big hammer comes down and you do a measurement and it's all over. And that's very confusing. For example, in quantum computing, it's been a very confusing thing because
it's ridiculous.
In quantum computing, the basic idea is you're going to use all these separate threads of computation, so to speak, to do all the different parts of, try these different factors for an integer or something like this. And it looks like you can do a lot because you've got all these different threads going on. But then you have to say, well, at the end of it, you've got all these threads, and every thread came up with a definite answer. But we've got to conflate those together to figure out a definite thing that we humans can take away from it, a definite, so the computer actually produced this output.
So having this branchial space and this hypergraph model of physics, do you think it's possible to then make predictions that are definite about many-body quantum mechanical systems? Is that the point?
I think it's but I don't, this is every one of these things. When you go from the underlying theory, which is complicated enough, the theory at some level is beautifully simple. But as soon as you start actually trying to, it's this whole question about how do you bridge it to things that we humans can talk about. It gets really complicated. And this thing about actually getting it to a definite prediction about definite thing you can say about chemistry or something like this. That's just a lot of work. So I'll give you an example. There's a thing called the quantum Zeno effect. So the idea is, quantum stuff happens, but then if you make a measurement, you're kind of freezing time in quantum mechanics. And so it looks like there's a possibility that with sort of the relationship between the quantum Zeno effect and the way that many-body quantum mechanics works and so on, maybe conceivably it may be possible to actually figure out a way to measure the maximum entanglement speed. And the reason we can potentially do that is because the systems we deal with in terms of atoms and things, they're pretty big. A mole of atoms is a lot of atoms. And, but it isn't a very, it's something where to get, when we're dealing with how can you see 10 to the minus 100, so to speak, well, by the time you've got, 10 to the 30 atoms, you're not, you're within a little bit closer striking distance of that. We've just got, two atoms, and we're trying to see down to 10 to the minus 100 meters or whatever. So I don't know how it will work. This is a potential direction. And if you can tell, by the way, if we could measure the maximum entanglement speed, we would know the elementary law. These are all related. So if we get that
Did I just skip my
we
turn?
just need one number. If we can get that one number, we can, the theory has no parameters anymore. There are other places where there's another
It is.
because in cosmology, in this model, one of the features is the universe is not fixed dimensional. I mean, we think we live in three-dimensional space. But this hypergraph doesn't have any particular dimension. It's
That was dumb. I hit the button at the wrong time.
you say, what's the volume of a sphere in the hypergraph, where a sphere is defined as how many nodes do you get to when you go a distance r away from a given point? And you can say, well, if I get to about r cubed nodes when I go a distance r away in the hypergraph, then I'm living roughly in three-dimensional space. But you might also get to r to the point, 2.92, for some value of r. As r increases, that might be the sort of fit to what happens. And so one of the things we suspect is that the very early universe is essentially infinite dimensional, and that as the universe expanded, it became lower dimensional. And so one of the things that is another little sort of point where we think there might be a way to actually measure some things is dimension fluctuations in the early universe. That is there leftover dimension fluctuation of at the time of the cosmic microwave background, 100,000 years or something after the beginning of the universe? Is it still the case that there were pieces of the universe that didn't have dimension 3, that had dimension 3.01 or something? And can we tell that?
Is that possible to observe the fluctuations in dimensions? I don't even know what that entails.
Okay, so the question, which should be an elementary exercise in electrodynamics, except it isn't, is understanding what happens to a photon when it propagates through 3.01 dimensional space. So, for example, the inverse square law is a consequence of the surface area of a sphere is proportional to r squared. But if you're not in three-dimensional space, the surface area of a sphere is not proportional to r squared, it's r to the whatever, 2.01 or something. And so that means that I think when you try and do optics, a common principle in optics is Huygens' principle, which basically says that every piece of a wavefront of light is a source of new spherical waves. And those spherical waves, if they're different dimensional spherical waves, will have other characteristics. And so there will be bizarre optical phenomena which we haven't figured out yet.
So you're looking for some weird photon trajectories that designate that it's 3.01 dimensional space?
Yeah, that would be an example of, there are only a certain number of things we can measure about photons. We can measure their polarization, we can measure their frequency, we can measure their direction, those kinds of things. And, how that all works out, in the current models of physics, it's been hard to explain how the universe manages to be as uniform as it is. And that's led to this inflation idea that, to the great annoyance of my then collaborator, we figured out in 1979, we had this realization that you could get something like this, but it seemed implausible that that's the way the universe worked, so we put in a footnote. And that was, but in any case, I've never really completely believed it, but that's an idea for how to sort of puff out the universe faster than the speed of light, early moments of the universe, that's the sort of inflation idea, and that you can somehow explain how the universe manages to be as uniform as it is. In our model, this turns out to be much more natural because the universe just starts very connected. The hypergraph is not such that the ball that you grow starting from a single point has volume r cubed. It might have volume r to the 500 or r to the infinity. And so that means that you sort of naturally get this much higher degree of connectivity and uniformity in the universe. And then the question is, this is sort of the mathematical physics challenge, is in the standard theory of the universe, there's the three-big universe, which is the kind of standard model where the universe is isotropic and homogeneous, and you can then work out the equations of general relativity, and you can figure out how the universe expands. We would like to do the same kind of thing, including dimension change. This is just difficult mathematical physics. The reason it's difficult is the sort of fundamental reason it's difficult. When people invented calculus 300 years ago, calculus was the story of understanding change and change as a function of a variable. People study univariate calculus, they study multivariate calculus, it's one variable, it's two variables, three variables, but whoever studied, 2.5 variable calculus, turns out nobody. Turns out that, but what we need to have to understand these fractional dimensional spaces, which don't work like, they're spaces where the effective dimension is not an integer.
So you can't apply the tools of calculus naturally and easily to fractional dimensions.
No.
And so somebody has to figure out how to do that.
We're trying to figure this out. I mean, it's very interesting. It's very connected to very frontier issues in mathematics. It's very beautiful.
So is it possible, we're dealing with a scale that's so much smaller than a human scale. Is it possible to make predictions versus explanations? Do you have a hope that with this hypergraph model you'd be able to make predictions?
Yeah.
That then could be validated with a physics experiment, predictions that couldn't have been done or weren't done otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, I think...
In which domain do you think?
Okay, so there are going to be cosmology ones to do with dimension fluctuations in the universe. That's a very bizarre effect. Dimension fluctuation is just something nobody ever looked for that. If anybody sees dimension fluctuation, that's a huge flag that something like our model is going on. And how one detects that, that's a problem of that's a problem of traditional physics in a sense of what's the best way to actually figure that out. And for example, that's one. There are all kinds of things one can imagine. I mean, there are things that in black hole mergers, it's possible that there will be effects of maximum entanglement speed in large black hole mergers. That's another possible thing.
And all of that is detected through what? Do you have a hope for LIGO type of situation, like with gravitational waves?
Yeah, or alternatively, I mean, I think it's, look, figuring out experiments is like figuring out technology inventions. That is, you've got a set of raw materials, you've got an underlying model, and now you've got to be very clever to figure out, what is that thing I can measure that just somehow, leverages into the right place. And we've spent less effort on that than I would have liked, because one of the reasons is that I think that the physicists who've been working on our models with now lots of physicists actually, it's very, very nice. It's kind of it's one of these cases where I'm really kind of pleasantly surprised that the sort of absorption of the things we've done has been quite rapid and quite very positive.
So it's a Cambrian explosion of physicists too, not just ideas.
Yes, I mean, a lot of what's happened that's really interesting, and again, not what I expected, is there are a lot of areas of sort of very elaborate, sophisticated mathematical physics, whether that's causal set theory, whether it's higher category theory, whether it's categorical quantum mechanics, all sorts of elaborate names for these things, spin networks, perhaps, the causal dynamical triangulations, all kinds of names of these fields. And these fields have a bunch of good mathematical physicists in them who've been working for decades in these particular areas. And the question is, but they've been building these mathematical structures. And the mathematical structures are interesting, but they don't typically sit on anything. They're just mathematical structures. And I think what's happened is our models provide kind of a machine code that lives underneath those models. So a typical example, this is due to Jonathan Gorard, who's one of the key people who's been working on our project. This is I'll give you an example just to give a sense of how these things connect. This is in causal set theory. So the idea of causal set theory is there are, in space-time, we imagine that there's space and time, one-dimensional setup. We imagine that there are just events that happen at different times and places in space and time. And the idea of causal set theory is the only thing you say about the universe is there are a bunch of events that happen sort of randomly at different places in space and time. And then the whole sort of theory of physics has to be to do with this graph of causal relationships between these randomly thrown down events. So they've always been confused by the fact that to get even Lorentz invariance, even relativistic invariance, you need a very special way to throw down those events. And they've had no natural way to understand how that would happen. So what Jonathan figured out is that, in fact, from our models, they, instead of just generating events at random, our models necessarily generate events in some pattern in space-time effectively that then leads to Lorentz invariance and relativistic invariance and all those kinds of things. So it's a place where all the mathematics that's been done and where we just have a random collection of events. Now what consequences does that have in terms of causal set theory and so on? That can all be kind of wheeled in now that we have some different underlying foundational idea for what the particular distribution of events is, as opposed to just where we throw down random events. And so that's a typical sort of example of what we're seeing in all these different areas of kind of how you can take, really interesting things that have been done in mathematical physics and connect them. And it's really kind of beautiful, because the sort of the abstract models we have just seem to plug into all these different, very interesting, very elegant abstract ideas. But we're now giving sort of a reason for that to be the way, for a reason for one to care. I mean, it's like saying, you can think about computation abstractly. You can think about, combinators or something as abstract computational things, and you can sort of do all kinds of study of them. But it's like, why do we care? Well, okay, Turing machines are a good start, because you can kind of see they're sort of mechanically doing things. But when we actually start thinking about computers computing things, we have a really good reason to care.
That'll do.
And this is sort of what we're providing, I think, is a reason to care about a lot of these areas of mathematical